Welcome to the My Friend the Friar podcast, and thanks for listening. If you like My Friend the Friar and want to support us, please consider subscribing or following us if you haven't already done so. And if you found us on YouTube, then don't forget to click the notification bell when you subscribe so you'll be notified of new episodes when they release. Thanks again, and God bless. Oh gosh, we're just...
You were confused, huh? You were like...
I know. I was like, wait a minute, what am I saying? It's like when you're at Mass and you're just following what everyone else is doing, and you're just like, I hope that's the right gang sign that I'm throwing.
We were the Bloods.
Yeah.
the precious Bloods.
Oh, priest humor. That's what we should do, an episode on priest humor.
There's no such thing, so...
Yeah. Boring. You guys are so serious. All right.
I know.
Here we go. I'm John Lee, and I'm joined by Father Steven Sanchez, a discalced Carmelite priest. Good afternoon, Father.
Good afternoon, John. How are you?
I am both fine and dandy today. It's a little hot in Texas.
It's a little hot in Arkansas, too.
Yeah. Oh, summer. All right, yeah. Before we get started, just want to take a quick moment to thank everyone for listening and just encourage y'all, if you are enjoying what you're hearing, please subscribe, share us with others, pray for us, because we don't know what we're doing.
Yes, please. Two guys in the garage just chatting.
Yeah. All right. Martyrs. We're on our final planned, at least for this series, final kind of planned episode for those who have borne witness to Christ and his church. And man, we have been all over the world since 1500s. And it's like nothing's ever changed, right? It's
yes. Yeah.
Same song, different verse.
Correct. Same theme.
Yeah.
So we talked last about the Chinese martyrs. And then we talked about the martyrs of the French Revolution. And so today I want to just touch a little bit closer to home, and that is south of the border in Mexico, what is known as the Cristero War that lasted from 1926 to 1929.
I had no idea that this even happened. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just down south of us.
Yeah, and recent, right?
Yes.
So 1920s. Well, I mean, I guess it's like 100 years ago almost now, but it doesn't feel like it. I was super shocked by this.
Yeah. So what happened, just like in France, there was a popular uprising against the church. In Mexico, there was a popular uprising in defense of the church. What happened was the people in central and western Mexico started to struggle with and to oppose or to protest against the implementation of anti-clerical and secular article of the 1917 Constitution of Mexico that was drawn up by President Carranza. And he did that because he wanted, again, there is this whole idea that a lot of the presidents, a lot of the political parties in Mexico are Masons. So I don't know if that's true or not, but that's a lot of the suspicions is that's why they're against the church. But anyway, so President Carranza wanted to, again, limit the power of the faith of the church. And so he implemented these articles in the 1917 Constitution, but they were never really implemented. It's not until President Gaius becomes president, and he issues an executive. Blah, blah, let me see if I can say that without my accent. President Gaius issued an executive order to enforce the articles of the 1917 Constitution, seeking to eliminate the Catholic Church. So as the armies are beginning to implement the articles, there's resistance, there's protests. President Gaius is trying to shutter the churches, close up the churches, and make the church illegal. So one of the things that most people don't know is not only about this persecution of the church in Mexico in the 20s, but also that the United States supported the Mexican army in its struggle against the Catholic Church. What people don't know is that in the 1920s, the KKK offered President Gaius $10 million to fight the Catholic Church. Okay, so yeah, the United States is involved in the internal politics of this sovereign government, especially against the Catholic Church. It was later that the American ambassador, Dwight Morrow, mediated negotiations between Gaius and the Catholic Church. But let's get back to the Cristero War. Skirmishes broke out in 1926. So, okay, the articles were instituted in 1917 Constitution. So now, almost 10 years later, they're trying to implement these articles in the Constitution that were anti-clerical and anti-church, the secularist articles. So skirmishes begin to break out because they're going to come close the church, and of course you have the abuelita. They're like, you're not going to shut down my church, and so you have all these people like, no, you're not shutting down my church, and so you have these skirmishes that begin in 1926, and there was actually violent uprisings in 1927. So the reason it's called the Cristero War, or the Cristo is Spanish for Christ. Cristero is someone who belongs to Christ, or like a Christian war. The rebels would invoke, "Long live Christ the King. Viva Cristo Rey." That's what they were shouting. And so they were being, as they're fighting with the armies of the Mexican armies, they're fighting that, "Long live Christ the King." In other words, that no, you a secular power do not have power over the church. And so that's how all that began to come about. So in August of 1926 in Guadalajara, in the state of Jalisco, 400 armed Catholics shut themselves in a church, Our Lady of Guadalupe, I think, shut themselves up in a church to prevent the church from being bolted, the doors bolted shut by the federal armies. So these 400 armed Catholics in the church are there to keep the church from being shuttered. The federal armies show up and they exchange gunfire. And so then that's where basically the war begins, is in Guadalajara in Jalisco. And so after the skirmishes with the armed Catholics there, so they throughout the country of Mexico, armies started attacking and killing priests in order to bolt shut the doors of the churches. And so then there was uprisings all throughout Mexico, but mostly in central and western Mexico. So what's happening too, and this is something, if you ever watch the movie, if you get to see the movie For Greater Glory, it's a movie about the Cristeros and a particularly young martyr that was recently canonized. The armies would publicly hang the Cristeros on main thoroughfares throughout Mexico. You'd see them hanging from telephone poles, they'd kill them, they'd hang them, and as a warning to, again, trying to intimidate the church and trying to intimidate those people that were resisting the government in trying to shut down the church. So the Cristero War claimed the lives of 90,000 people, 56,000 federales, or government armies of the government, 56,000, almost 57,000, and 30,000 Cristeros. The rebellion attracted the attention of Pope Pius XI, who issued a series of papal encyclicals from 1925 to 1937. In 1926, he published the article on the persecution of the church in Mexico, Iniquis Afflictisicae, and despite the government's promises that the persecutions would cease, the persecutions continued. And the Pope then issued Acerba Anime on September 29th, 1932. Then a letter to the bishops of Mexico, Firmissimam Constantiam, which supported the Catholic Action Movement. In other words, you could say like guerrilla, the underground church in Mexico.
Yeah.
So what happened, and this was a real tragedy, is that the church withdrew its support from the Cristeros, and the conflict ended in 1929. The reason that it's a tragedy is that the church ordered all the Cristeros to put down their weapons. So they the Cristeros went and they surrendered their weapons, and once they surrendered their weapons, the armies executed them. They massacred them. So there was a lot of resentment of the local church in Mexico because it was because they obeyed their church that they laid down their weapons, and then they were executed by the armies. The following president, Portes Gil, kept the articles of the 1917 Constitution, but he did not enforce them. And so the Constitution was not amended until 1992.
Yeah, that's crazy.
The church was illegal.
Yeah, that when I read that in her notes, like, it just blew my mind. That's because it's not.
When I went to visit our monastery,
I was going to say, there's all these weird laws, like in the United States, right? Like you can't park your elephant in the main street or something weird, right? There's
correct.
just all sorts of stuff. But this isn't some obscure law or constitution, right? And so it just blew my mind that it lasted that long. Or
so when I would go visit
when
I visited our monasteries in Mexico, I was confused by it, right? So so the church is illegal here, right? Yeah, but we still have mass. We still have the shrine of the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe. He goes, yeah, it's just that the church on paper is still illegal. I go, okay, so then you have a monastery here. So I went to go visit the monastery of San Joaquin, which at that time was 400 years old, which really blew my mind. I'm standing there in front of this monastery going like, okay, this is 400 years old. The United States is 200 years old. Wow. So in my talking with some of the friars there, I said, how does this work? How does this? He goes, well, he says, the government turns a blind eye. He says, monasteries do not exist in Mexico. I go, no, here we are. We're standing in a monastery.
Yeah. Wait a minute.
How can they not exist? He says, well, on paper, this is a hotel. I go, what?
Wow.
He goes, yeah, on paper, this is a hotel. It's not a church.
Yeah, because when were you ordained?
92.
Okay, so what could something had happened to a priest or a nun or a church without consequence during this time because it was still technically legal or illegal for the church, right?
Yeah, it was still illegal. But again, you have a very 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 Catholic population, and so you have a government that was not Catholic. And so then the government was stuck with, how do we deal with this? And so again, the people refused to have their churches shut down. Like, no, you're not shutting down our churches. And so it was interesting that it was the the Constitution was amended in 1992, and the reason it was amended in 1992 is because I think the year before, or in 1990, I forget, Pope John Paul made a visit to Mexico. So Mexico found itself
hosting a criminal, right?
How do we welcome the Pope as the leader of a state, the Vatican State, the leader of the Catholic Church? How can we welcome him into the country when the Catholic Church is illegal and he himself doesn't exist? How? So they found themselves in this conflict, and so then they said, well, we just need to change the Constitution. So they amended the constitutions, and they legalized the church then in 92. So it's crazy.
That's just
crazy,
weird.
crazy. And so in May 2000, Pope John Paul II canonized a group of 25 martyrs. And in 2005, he canonized another group of 13 martyrs. And if you watch the movie, For Greater Glory, the youngest martyr, or the martyr that the movie is focusing on, is a 14-year-old martyr, Jose Sanchez del Rio. It's a very moving film. I saw it in the theaters. I saw it twice in the theaters. The first time I saw it, I had to go back and see it again because I was so emotional. I was crying. And so actually, some people were sobbing openly at towards the end of the movie when this 14-year-old is being martyred, is being tortured by army guys, right? And so armed militia.
Well, no
so
spoiler alerts for people who want to see this.
So he's being tortured. And so people were crying. I was like, oh. So I had to like, okay, I now I know what to expect. So I can go back and watch it. Just like sort of like The Passion.
Yeah.
The first time I saw The Passion, I was so stunned by it all. I said, I have to go back now, and now that I know what to expect, because I was so shocked by it. So
yeah, and even anyway. Still, like with The Passion, I still can't watch it without just getting teared up. Like, it is just so hard to watch. So
yes,
and For Greater Glory, it's based off a book as well, right?
No, there is a book about, or that takes place during the time of the Cristero War, and that book is by Graham Greene, called The Power and the Glory. And in The Power and the Glory by Graham Greene, it's a very interesting novel in that it's about you have what they call the whiskey priest. You have an alcoholic priest in Mexico during the Cristero persecution, and even though he struggles with his alcoholism, he continuously goes back to. He risks his life continuously to perform the sacraments, to anoint the sick, to secretly celebrate the Eucharist. And so what Graham Greene is doing, he's manifesting how this whiskey priest, this bad priest, this alcoholic priest, is being faithful to the sacraments and giving the sacraments. And then you also have priests who gave up the priesthood according to because of the persecution, just like you had apostates in the Japanese persecution.
Yeah.
In the Mexican persecution, you had priests who gave up their priesthood and got married and had families. And so you have these priests who, under duress or under the threat of losing their lives, they decided no, peace out. So then you have these two examples. And then you also have another example of a indigenous person of Mexico who is continuously harassing this whiskey priest. So it's a very, very, very good book. It makes you think. So Graham Greene's book is called The Power and the Glory. And the movie about the Cristero War is For Greater Glory, and it stars Andy Garcia is the leading star in that. It's a very good movie as well. I'm not sure if I think there is a book on the Cristero War. I haven't read it. It's one of the books I would like to read. I think it's called Altars Drenched in Blood or something like that. There's something about the Cristero War that I haven't had time to dive into, but it's very interesting. And so for us, the reason you got to know me is because our priests left Mexico during the religious persecution in the 20s, because our priests were from Spain, and they had churches, they had territories and monasteries in Mexico. They were driven out during the wars, during the persecution of the church, and we came to the United States in 1914, 1916, something like that, during the persecution of the church had begun before the 1917 articles. So they had come into the United States around that time, 1916, 1914, around there. And Pancho Villa, captured our community in Torreon. And then he was going to execute them. He hated priests and he hated Spaniards. So he put them under the ban. They were going to be executed. And then the wife of the American ambassador intervened for them and got Pancho Villa to commute the sentence from death to exile. So our friars, our fathers, were put on a cattle train with about 2,000 other Spaniards, and they were sent to Texas border. So they came into the United States. It happened to be Holy Week when they were arrested, and they were at the border all Holy Thursday and Good Friday.
Wow.
And then until they were allowed to come into the United States, and that's how you and I got to know each other, because of the religious persecution in Mexico. That is how the Carmelites came to south of the United States, the Spaniards, and so they were going to go back to Spain. So they begged their way to New York to beg their way across the ocean to go back to Spain, and Father General sent them a telegram saying, no, you need to go back down to the south, because all the Mexicans that are leaving Mexico, that are fleeing into the United States because of the persecution, have no one to celebrate the sacraments for them. So you have to go back down there and minister to them. So that was basically the mission of the Carmelites that came out of Mexico, was to stay in the south and to minister to the Hispanic population, to provide the sacraments for them.
And I was thinking about, so many people died, but how many more tens of thousands fled, right? And here in Texas especially, there's people are doing everything they can, legal or not, to get here because they're running, right? They're from something. And it's just rough, right? Doesn't make doing illegal things right. It's just gosh, it's rough. And your heart has to break, Yeah.
You're trying to protect your family, whether you're staying or you're running, or it's economic oppression or religious suppression or political oppression. So whatever it is, it's difficult.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of consequences of that.
Yeah. Now there's two other things I've come to realize, and I'm not quite sure why either one of them, but you seem to be quite the movie buff, right? All your don't as you're taking a drink, you start choking. You seem to watch a lot of movies.
It was water.
Okay.
I do a lot of reading, and I do like film.
Like a good movie, huh?
I like a good movie. There's some stuff that I won't watch. So if you're a Fast and Furious fan, I am very sorry, but no, that's
vroom, right?
Yeah, that's I don't have a problem with popcorn movies. I don't have a problem with something that is, funny or just rom-com or something like that. Depends, but I prefer to watch something of substance or something that I can think about. Right.
Yeah.
So while I was in Spain, when I was studying in Spain, I had two of my classmates there. One was from Andalusia, from the southern part of Spain, Father Jesus, and there was another priest from Mexico, Father Guillermo. And sometimes we would take the train into Madrid to watch a movie, to watch a film, and then afterwards we would go and have a beer, and we'd sit and we'd say, okay, so what did you think about the movie? Well, what is the point of view? What is the director trying to teach? What is the philosophy? What is it trying to sell and stuff? And we sit there and we'd discuss the film. So I like films.
What's that? Gosh, Betty is gonna shout the name of the movie at me, but the something pan and vino, or pan and vino.
Marcelino Pan y Vino. Marcelino Pan y Vino.
It's so good. It's such a good old movie. Yeah, I like a good movie too. The second thing I noticed about, and this really surprised me, you've been struggling with these Japanese and Chinese names and some of the French ones, but you nailed every one of these Spanish names, and I can't seem to figure out why.
It's I've practiced. I've been practicing for about 64 years.
Oh, I was going to say you're what, 29? Goodness. Well, speaking
the
of
genes, man.
Yeah, genes. Speaking of 29, the last section of martyrdom that we're planning on talking about, we got to go back to a little bit past 1929, so we're back into the mid or the early 1900s.
Yes,
and it's a very famous time, World War II.
Yeah, there were martyrs. It wasn't. There's a lot of martyrs that we don't know about because there's no existing documentation, but there are some that we do know about. We do know about some of the persecutions by the Nazis and the communist Russia against the church and against anybody that stood for justice or the dignity of the human person.
Yeah.
So,
and this starts in what, 39
World War II.
in Poland, right?
Yep. From 39 to 45 is World War II. So the reason the war begins, and we get involved later, the reason the war begins is because Hitler invades Poland. So as Hitler invades Poland, you have the resistance of not only just the Polish nationals, but also the Polish church. So there are, in World War II, there are 108 Polish martyrs that were recognized, and they died or they suffered between 1939 to 1945, and they were either killed by Nazis or the Soviet army. Half of Poland's Catholic priests, monks, and nuns were killed. That's more than 2,800 killed by Nazis and the Soviet army. Poland lost 90% of its 3 million Jewish minority. So almost all of the Jews are exterminated in Poland. There in Dallas, you have the Sisters of the Holy Family of Nazareth. They have, I think, 14, 15, 16 martyrs that were executed by the Nazis as well.
Wow.
So there's a lot of stuff that happened. Again, as I said, because towards the end of the war, when they saw that they were losing, a lot of stuff was burnt. A lot of the documentation was burnt. A lot of the stuff was done away with, both by the Russians and by the Nazis. So we don't have a lot of documentation, but we do know of some. And so during this time, during the Nazi occupation, there are a couple of famous martyrs that we know about. We know of Saint Maximilian Kolbe,
Yep.
who was martyred in 1941, and he was a Franciscan, and he took the place of someone else. He died in the place of someone else, as a Catholic and as a Catholic priest. So he's one of the martyrs then of World War II by the Nazis. And the one that I want to talk about is Saint Teresa Benedicta. She's, again, another Carmelite nun. Saint Teresa Benedicta was martyred in 1942, and sometimes she's also known as Edith Stein. That was her name in the world.
Yeah, I've heard that.
And then
name
she
before.
took the name. Yeah, Teresa Benedicta. So she was born in 1891 in Breslavia, which is currently in Poland. She was born into a Jewish family, and by the age of 15, she professed herself to be an atheist. Her dad died when she was young. Her mom was a very strong woman. Her mom took over the family business, which was a lumber business, and her mom was very, very devout Orthodox Jew. But somehow or other, because of what she sees around her, the world or something, she began to lose her faith in God, and so she proclaims herself an atheist by the time she's 15. And they think that's because her older sister kind of left the Jewish faith, and she was kind of sort of following in the footsteps of her sister, like, okay, so if she's questioning the faith, then that means I can question the faith. So she becomes a proclaimed atheist at the age of 15. So then in 1911, she begins to attend the University of Breslau. So she attends the university from 1911 to 1913. And it's during this time that she meets the philosopher Edmund Husserl, who was the great phenomenologist. And so you can go look that up, phenomenology, the philosophy of phenomenology. And she started to attend lectures by Max Scheler on religion. And that was, his conferences were on religion, the holy, and creaturehood. And Max Scheler was also beginning to be influenced by Christians. So what she finds interesting is that you find yourself in a university of all these intellectuals and academicians, and all of a sudden she was like, oh, some of these people believe in Jesus Christ. Some of these people are Christian. And so she begins to be interested in that. So then from 1913 to 1915, she studies philosophy under Husserl in Göttingen, and she volunteers for the Red Cross during World War I. And so she becomes aware of the horrors of war, right? And some of her friends die in the war, and it kind of gets her to think about things and about mortality and, again, the ultimate questions. So from 1916 to 1918, she follows Husserl to Freiburg University, and she becomes his assistant. And she graduates with summa cum laude from the university. And one of her favorite professors converts to Lutheranism, converts to Christianity, as he is dying from battle wounds. So again, this gets her to think about ultimate questions, these people that have faith, that death is not something that really frightens them, and they're dying in peace. And so it's a time of questioning for Edith Stein. So then from 1919 to 1923, it's a time of her private philosophical work. She tries to gain a philosophical chair in a university, but she's resisted because she's Jewish. And so you already have then this kind of unspoken prejudice against her. So then in the summer of 1921, she was visiting a friend of hers at a farm, and so she went to go spend some time with her. And she discovers the work of St. Teresa of Jesus, St. Teresa of Avila. She discovers the work that we call the autobiography or the life of Teresa. And so the friend of hers is a Christian, and she's a widow, and so they spend time talking about stuff. And when she discovers this work of St. Teresa of Jesus in the library, she stays up all night to read it. And that's a feat. If you know the work of St. Teresa of Jesus, the book of her life is something that you cannot read in one night. But Edith Stein did. So she stayed up all night reading it. And then when she finished reading it the next morning, she says, I have found the truth. So the next thing she does is she immediately goes into town. She buys the Catechism of the Catholic Church and a daily missal. And she begins to study and want to be part of this community, right? So she's baptized on January 1st, 1922. She goes to the city of Spire as a teacher at a Dominican school, and she lives and prays with the sisters for the next 8 years. One of the things that she talks about, she had visited Spire before she entered the church. She and a friend of hers were visiting Spire, and they go to the cathedral, not because of interest, but sort of a tourist's, like, oh, let's go look at this pretty building and sort of admire the architecture, right? And so they go into the cathedral, and then Edith Stein says that she was amazed that some lady walks in with her groceries, her grocery bags. She walks into the cathedral, she goes in there, and she just sits to pray. And what interested Edith was that she says, nobody ever goes to the temple except for liturgy. Nobody ever goes to a Protestant church except for liturgy. Nobody goes in to just sit and pray. And so that impressed her, and she began to question herself, like, why are these people coming into this place when there's no meeting, right? So that stuck with her, this idea that people come in to sit and pray. So anyway, she goes back to Spire, and she's a teacher at a Dominican school for 8 years. From 1923 to 1931, she gives lectures on education in Germany and parts of Europe. In 1932 to 1933, she's a teacher at the German Institute for Scientific Pedagogy, how to teach, right? Due to the rise of National Socialism and the requirement of an Aryan certificate, she can no longer teach because she's Jewish. Okay, 1933, she enters the Discalced Carmelite monastery in Cologne, Germany. She continues her philosophical writings. Hitler takes the role of leader of Germany in 1934. In 1933. In 1934, Edith receives the habit, and she takes the name Teresa Benedicta a Croce. In 1935, she makes her first profession of vows. In 1938, she makes her solemn vows. And then 1938, in November 9th and 10th, you have the Kristallnacht, or the breaking of the glasses, where there was the overt persecution of all Jewish businesses, breaking glass, right? The Kristallnacht, night of the glass. So in December of 38, she leaves the Carmel of Cologne because it's coming under Nazi occupation, and she goes to Holland, which is a neutral country, and she enters the Carmel in Echt in Holland, hoping to be safe there, and her sister, Rosa, goes with her. So 1939 to 1942, she resumes her writing. Then the Nazis invade Holland in 1940, and Teresa is writing a book on the spirituality of St. John of the Cross in preparation for the celebration of the 400th anniversary of St. John of the Cross's birth. And she writes this book, The Science of the Cross, which you can still purchase, right? In 1942, the Nazis retaliate against the Dutch bishop's July letter that condemns the Nazis' anti-Semitism. So then the Nazis begin to persecute all the Catholics in the area, right? In their sphere of power, so all the Dutch Catholics, right? So all Catholics of Jewish descent are arrested and deported, including 15 religious, 5 of them Trappist monks. So Teresa and her blood sister, Rosa, who had also converted to Catholicism, were arrested, and they were deported to a concentration camp in Westerbork, Holland. Then from there, they're deported to Auschwitz on August 7th. And then on August 9th, Teresa
Yeah.
Benedicta and her sister Rosa die in the gas chambers. And one of the things is that she was wearing her habit in in the concentration camp. And a lot of the people that survived after the end of the war remembered that people would go and visit her in the concentration camp, and they'd say she was very peaceful. She spent a lot of time ministering to the children and to the wives that had lost husbands and children and sons and daughters, and so she was busy ministering and trying to maintain peace and keeping her life centered on Christ. But she was, because she was Jewish and because she was Catholic, for the double crime, she was put into the gas chamber, and she was beatified in 1987 and canonized in 1998. She wrote tons and tons and tons and tons of works. Some of her stuff still has not been translated into English yet. So you have The Science of the Cross, you have On Empathy, you have several other books that you can purchase. But I think The Science of the Cross is the most famous one because it's basically her synthesis of St. John of the Cross's works and the spirituality of St. John of the Cross. So you have that. And again, as I said, we don't have a lot of information because a lot of the stuff was destroyed by the Nazis and the Russian armies. There is, speaking about my fascination with films, there is a Spanish movie that's called The Photographer of Munchen or something like that. And basically it's a Spanish language movie. You can get in English subtitles. And basically it's this guy in the concentration camp who knows how to take photographs, and then the Nazis start hiring him to take photographs of the prisoners and of the German officers themselves. And so it's this whole thing of him taking these photographs, right? And it's a very interesting movie because eventually when the Nazis know that they're losing the war, they start destroying a lot of the documentation, a lot of the photographs, and he finds a way to sneak the film out. And the only reason we have some of the photographs is because this guy, it's based on a historical person, he was able to sneak out the films so that there was proof of what the Nazis were doing in the concentration camps. Again, power, corruption.
Yeah. It's overwhelming the more you sit and think about it. And it's exactly the same. It's exactly the same thing that was going on in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and the time of the church and the Romans. And it's like it never ends.
Yes.
It never ends.
Yeah. Yeah. And so lastly, again, talking about the corruption, lastly, I would just want to mention briefly that in Latin America, again, because of the corrupt political regimes and dictatorships, right? You have all the desaparecidos under Pinochet. You have all these people in the different dictatorships where people just disappear and where priests disappear because they speak out against the corruption or they speak out against the oppression. The one that I just want to mention very briefly is Bishop Oscar Romero in El Salvador, who was assassinated on March 24th, 1980, while he was celebrating the Eucharist at a hospital chapel. And he was assassinated because he was speaking out against the oppression of the government and the position of the poor and how the poor were being oppressed and they were being exploited, and he was speaking out against them. And so he was assassinated while celebrating Mass. I went to go visit, actually, while I was in Salvador. I visited the chapel and talked to the sisters that were with him, that were there when he was shot. And he was shot while he was elevating the host. And they said that as he was elevating the host, the assassin just shot through the door and killed him at the altar. And so you have that. And again, they still don't know who ordered the assassination. They have an idea, but even then, there's like, well, was it the government?
Can't prove it.
Who was it? Yeah, they really can't prove it. And so you have that. And again, because he's speaking to people in power about their corruption, and so people in power do not want to be questioned. And then the other one is just recently beatified Stanley Rother, who's a martyr, who is from Oklahoma. And in fact, they're just building a basilica in honor of him in outside of Oklahoma City. He was assassinated on July 28th, 1980 in Santiago Atitlan in Guatemala because he had the audacity to educate the indigenous. He translated the Gospels into the native language. He was teaching them how to read. He was teaching them about, the dignity that they had as people, and he was speaking out against, again, the exploitation of the poor. And army people went and they killed him in his rectory. So the indigenous people there in Santiago Atitlan, when they were transporting his body, before they transported his body back to the United States for burial, they begged his family if they could keep his heart.
Yeah.
So after they translated the body back to the United States for burial, during the preparation of the body, the family sent back the heart of Stanley Rother, and it's buried under the altar at Santiago Atitlan, in the church there at Santiago Atitlan. And so he's celebrated now as this martyr. And there's a book written by him called The Shepherd Cannot Run. And he's talking about how even in the face of oppression, he came to the United States to spend some time in the United States to think about this and to pray about this, whether he was going to go back or not. He said, well, yeah, I have to go back. And so he went back to be with his people. And again, because of political corruption and speaking against power, he was assassinated for speaking up for the poor, for speaking up for the gospel that Jesus proclaims, and the gospel that Jesus is, and the option for the poor and the dignity of the poor.
Yeah. It reminds me too of, one of the, back during when the United States had slavery, it's like the thing that you did to rationalize your ability to own slaves is to dehumanize them, right?
Yes.
They're not as intelligent, or their skin color's different, so thus they're not fully human, so you can do kind of whatever you want. And so it seems like real similarly, these indigenous people, you have somebody who's just
right.
They're as human as you and I are, but that's scary to people in power, right? I guess it also just makes me think of all the people now who, we have some priests and bishops on social media who are not afraid to speak up for what's right.
Right.
And gosh, it's got to be scary because you just have no idea, right?
Yeah. Because if you preach the gospel, you're going to get pushback because, in fact, I was rereading, if you're familiar with Chesterton, G.K. Chesterton, I was rereading Orthodoxy. I was taking some notes because I like to take notes in books that I read, and then I digitize them so I have my files. I'm a total nerd. So as I was rereading Orthodoxy, he's talking about whenever you preach the truth of love, there will be bloodshed. And that sort of stuck with me. I was like, wow. And again, as we're preparing these podcasts on the martyrs, right? Again, it is about the love of Christ for the poor, the love of Christ for the dignity of the poor, the love of Christ that transcends all things. And so how this is something very scary to people in power, because if you love one another, then there is no us and them. And if you love one another and you educate the poor and you take care of the poor, then the poor see that they have a choice, that they have rights, that they have dignity, and then they want that and they desire that, which is a good thing. And of course, then that means, well, I can't keep them as chattel. I can't keep them as people that I can exploit and oppress. And so, of course, there's going to be pushback.
Yeah, and it's the gospel is so transformative. That love is so transformative. You have so many people throughout history, many of them saints, who were like born into crazy wealthy families and turned away from all of their power and all of their wealth because they saw something that was more important, right?
And we even have, for example, in the United States, one of the martyrs, indigenous martyrs in the United States, Cristero, who we celebrated not too long ago. She was an indigenous person, but she was a slave to another indigenous tribe, and then she finally gets freed, and she suffered for her Catholicism, and she was tortured and made fun of and everything, and she wound up dying as a martyr for her faith, for not giving up her faith in Jesus Christ. So you have Cristero, who is a native indigenous martyr. You also have I'm trying to remember her name, Bakita, an African slave. She was a slave that went to, I think, she was bought by an Italian. She wasn't a martyr, but she was a saint. She was bought by an Italian and given freedom, and how she embraces Catholicism because of the Italian family that bought her and had given her freedom. She embraces the faith because she sees how others are living that faith. And so again, that speaks of that there is something about the faith that is transformative, that can be scary. It's scary to people, like if you have that kind of a change.
Yeah. Well, and even when we're not in situations that are so dramatic, just the conversion of our own hearts is scary, right? We're so resistant to let Jesus in and let him, be Lord of all sorts of parts of our lives. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me.
Yeah.
Well, thank
you.
So
again, the question that you asked earlier is something again for us to think about too. I mean, how brave am I in terms of my faith? I mean, am I embarrassed about my faith? Am I willing to make the sign of the cross? Am I willing to live my faith? I remember when I was growing up in San Antonio, it was something that happened a lot and was sort of normal. And then later on, as I grew older, I found that it wasn't as common anymore. Whenever we were on the bus or whenever we were in the car and we drove past a Catholic church, we all made the sign of the cross because of the Blessed Sacrament.
Tabernacle, yeah.
Yeah, because of the tabernacle there, you made the sign of the cross, and you sort of you bowed your head a little bit, so acknowledgement of the divine presence there. And so I remember once when we were I was going to go visit my friend down, we're going to go see one of the monster movies at the Texas Theater in San Antonio. So I wasn't always a fan of great film, but back then I thought it was wonderful.
It's a popcorn movie, huh?
We're going to go see some kaiju movies. We're going to go see Destroy All Monsters or something or other, right? And so we're on the bus, and so as we're going downtown, we passed St. Agnes, which is the parish I used to belong to in San Antonio as a youngster. And as we're passing in front of St. Agnes, everybody in the bus made the sign of the cross, and it was just normal. It's like that's what we do. That's because Jesus is there. So I wonder now if that happens on buses still or not. So
I hope so. Reminds me, one of my friends, one of my church brothers' daughters, is I always forget exactly how to say it, but she's studying to become a sister, a nun, right? Anyway, she is really good at any time you walk. If we're over at St. Anne's, if we were to walk past the Adoration Chapel, she would always stop and bow and cross herself. And if we were in the main church by the narthex, she would always turn to the Tabernacle and St. Killian Chapel. And she was really good at it. And it stuck with me. And I try to be aware of it just because it's just that little thing that makes you go, why am not paying attention to that? Right?
Right.
Like the God of the universe is in that room, and I can't take a half
Yes.
second. Right? So I hope people still do. Maybe if you're not one of the people who crosses yourself, maybe you'll feel convicted to pick up the torch. Keep it going.
And not be ashamed
Yeah.
or embarrassed.
Yeah. Well, Father, thank you again.
You're welcome.
For taking
Thank
us
you for
through
your time.
this. Yeah. And again, we're trying to figure out how to get you all who are listening, if there's something that sticks with you or something else you want us to dig into or kind of explore, maybe it's something down in the show notes, so look for it, and hopefully we can get some of that
We'll get
feedback,
that figured
'cause
out.
we're nerds, and we like our history, we love our saints, and there's
We
so
love our
much to
faith.
explore. Yes.
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 Yes. Yes. So thank you very much. God bless. Thank you for your time and your patience.
Goodbye, everybody.